In the previous part of tutorial classes and objects, we have created a class and we have created three sections of the class: public, private, and protected. We have discussed the public and the private section, and we will discuss the protected section in the chapter inheritance. But in this tutorial, we will discuss how we can pass objects to a function. So way before, in previous tutorials of functions, we have already discussed how we can pass arrays to our function, and we have also seen how we can pass variables to a function, and that means that we are passing these as arguments. So now we will see how we can pass an object to a function, and we know that object by definition is an instance of a class. So we know that there are two ways of passing arguments to a function. Similarly, in this case also there are two ways, and we know that these are call by value and call by reference method. In the call by value method, we will just pass the value to the function, or we will just copy the values in the function call to the actual function parameters. And the next one is the call by reference method. And we know that in the call by reference method, we will make actual changes to the function, or you can say the parameters which were inside the main function. So we have discussed the difference between call by value and call by reference method before. So it is similar, it is same, exactly same in this case also. We will use an ampersand operator to refer to the object. So what we will do is we will just first create our class student again, and we will create a variable int roll number. And since we know that there are three sections of a class, and these three sections are private, public, and protected, so you will have to specify that which section this variable belongs to. So if you have not used any access specifier, it will be private by default. So this is a new concept. So it is private by default. It is unlike the structures. In structures, if you were creating variables inside the structure, they were public by default, so you can access the variable outside the structure. But in case of classes, it is showing a reciprocal behavior. That means that it is private by default instead of public. So since I will access this variable, I will not make it private, I will make it public and followed by a column. So it's no more private now. So next I will just create another function, display function. So now we will just end this class and we will create an object of this class. And we know that every object in our class has its own properties and behavior. That is, it has its own set of variables and functions. So let's suppose the object 1 has value of roll number as 5. So let's suppose there are some more variables like int subject name, so let's suppose the subject name is 20 for object 1. So if you want to pass this whole object to the function, then you can access these values using the object 1 and the dot operator. So it is similar to what we have done earlier. We have passed variables to a function, and we know that first thing that we need to do is to create the function prototype, and the function prototype is just how the function will look like. And since we are passing some argument to the function, and the argument is the will take the object, so this time void display will not look like this. We will change it to void display and the name of the class, because class is also a data type. It can act as a data type. So the argument is of the form of the class student. So you can now just use object 1 dot display, and you can pass another object like object 2 to this function display. So let's suppose the value of the roll number of object 2 is 15. Let's say there is another object 2 and the value of roll number is 15. So we are passing the object 2, we are passing the object 2 in the display function using object 1. So let's now end our main function, and let's now define our actual function. So we know that if we want to define it outside the class, you will have to use the name of the class followed by a scope resolution operator, that is 2:, then display. And now we will just use call by value method. The first method that we will use is call by value method, and we know that in the call by value method we will create an object that is of the class student. Let's name this object 3. So this object 2 will get copied to object 3 if you are using call by value method. If you want to use call by reference method, you will just apply ampersand before object, and there should be a space between this. So there should be a space here. So I will make it more clear here. If you want to use call by reference, you will write it like this, and you will also have to change the function prototype. You will have to make ampersand. So it is similar to what we have done before. We have already discussed how we can pass variables using call by value and call by reference method. So this is exactly same as the previous one, but in this case we are using object, so we will not use the data type and we will use the class name here, and we will pass this. Since we are using call by value, we will not use this reference operator. Now what we can do is we can use object 3 dot we can display the roll number of object 3. So when we call the function display, we are passing object 2 to the object 3 which will create another object 3, and it also has a value 15 in roll number. So we are displaying that value. If you will use call by reference, it will not create this value, it will just create a reference to the object 2. So if you are making any changes in the roll number, let's suppose you are incrementing the roll number or you are changing it, so it will also change it in the object 2. So we have discussed it before when we were discussing call by value and call by reference method. So even if you want to return an object, you can also do that. Let's suppose you want to return an object. We will do it similar to what we have done before. We will just change it, this void type, to the type of the function, type of the return type, and we will just return this object 3, and we will store this object 3 in some other object, let's say object 4. So if you make any changes here, this can be stored in the object 4. So what we have to do is object 1 comma object 2 comma object 4. So this is how we can pass objects, and we can even return /return objects from a function. So in this way we have ended our this subject, classes and objects, and we have covered most of the topics. Like we have covered how we can create objects, we can pass objects to a function, and we have also discussed the 3 main sections of a class, and we have also discussed the significance of the private access specifier in providing data abstraction in our code. In the next tutorial, we will discuss some types of function, and this is another set of functions, constructors and destructors. So we will discuss about constructors and destructors in the next tutorial. Before ending this lesson, I want to cover one more thing. That is, there are 2 types of functions. When you are writing a class, there are 2 types of, actually there are 3 types of function. So there are 3 types of function. Number 1 is known as getter functions, and sometimes we also call them accessor functions. So there are another set of functions known as setter functions, and the third type of function are the constructors and destructors, and these are also known as manager functions. And setter functions are also known as mutator functions. So these are the 3 types of functions, and constructors and destructors come under this classification. So these are very simple. Getter functions are those functions that will just assign some values that are used to return values. So if you will use these functions, you will get some values from them. So that's why the name getter functions. So these functions return some values, and they will return after making changes. So in getter functions, you will make some changes in the functions, and these functions are basically getter functions are used to return some variables, and these variables are basically the variables that we have put in the private section of the class. So let's suppose you have created a variable a in the private section and you want to access this variable outside the class. So we can actually do that. How we can do that? We can just create a function inside our class, and this function will return the value, because you know that this function can access the private section because it is inside the class. So let's suppose you want to create a getter function. That means you want to get the private variable. You will just write it like this: int getter, then int b return, let's not give any parameters or arguments inside it, we will return roll number. So this function will return, sorry, we will have to write it a here because a is inside the private section. So if there is any function that is returning a value that is private, so these functions are known as getter functions. And then there are setter functions, also known as mutator functions, and these functions are just used to set or assign values. So setter functions are used to assign values to our variables. So if there is a function, let's suppose void assign, and it is just used to assign the values. Let's suppose it is assigning marks I equals to 10. Let's make it marks 1 equals to 10. So this is assigning some values. So this type of function is known as setter functions because it is setting the values. The next one are the manager functions, constructors and destructors, and we will discuss it briefly in the next tutorial. So thanks for watching.